Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine a universe where gravity isn't a law of physics, but the active holding hand of a deity. Imagine a world where nature doesn't exist independently, where every beam of light and every slip of a foot on a muddy path is an act of sovereign will. Today, we aren't just reading sermons, we are stepping into the mind of Jonathan Edwards. We are exploring the most intense, rigorous, and frankly, terrifying arguments for the existence of God ever written on American soil. Whether you are a believer or a committed atheist, this is a challenge to your reality. It's time to look at the spider over the fire and the sweetness of honey to understand the architecture of belief.
It is a massive undertaking, and I think you put it perfectly. People hear Jonathan Edwards and they immediately think of, the caricature.
The angry man in the wig.
Exactly. The angry man in the wig shouting about hellfire. But when you actually sit down and engage with the source material we have here, these sermons, his biography, his private notes, you find something else entirely. You find perhaps the most formidable philosophical mind America has ever produced.
That's his reputation, certainly. The Saint of New England, they call him. But going through this stack of his work, saint almost feels too soft, doesn't it? It implies a kind of gentle piety.
It does.
What I get from this is something much harder, more severe. He feels less like a saint and more like a logician of the absolute.
That is a perfect way to frame it. Jonathan Edwards isn't trying to sell you something comforting. He's not really trying to persuade you in an emotional sense. He's trying to describe what he sees as the fundamental physics of a God-centered universe.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To decode that physics.
Precisely. We're going to analyze his most famous sermons, look at his private resolutions, and even the tragic end of his career to understand the logic of his God. It's all about the logic.
And we have to be clear right from the jump. This logic, this entire worldview, is the complete and total antithesis of the modern Western mindset.
Oh, completely. It's a head-on collision. The default setting of our culture, whether you're secular, atheist, or even, casually religious, is autonomy. The self. The idea that the human being is the center of the story. We're independent agents, we make our own meaning, and the universe is just this neutral stage we act on.
It's the backdrop.
It's the backdrop.
Yeah.
Edwards looks at that entire premise and essentially says, you are hallucinating. That is a fantasy.
It's not just wrong, it's a delusion.
Exactly. For Edwards, there is no neutral ground. There is no such thing as nature that just sort of runs on autopilot while God watches from the bleachers. For him, you are either infinitely, desperately dependent on God for your existence in this very microsecond, or you are a structural anomaly. You're an enemy of the universe's fundamental order, a bug in the system.
That binary is genuinely terrifying to think about. There's no middle path.
There is no middle path.
Yeah.
And that's what we're calling the absolute universe. In Edwards' mind, God is the only true substance. Everything else, you, me, the ground beneath our feet, the stars in the sky, is shadowy, fragile, and derivative.
So the tension of this whole deep dive is really seeing what happens when that worldview collides with the human ego, with our desperate need to be in control.
Exactly, and that collision starts early.
Well, let's start there then. Before he was the terrifying preacher of Northampton, he was a kid in Connecticut. And reading his early biography, it's clear he wasn't exactly a normal child.
No, born in 1703, and normal really doesn't cover it. He was a prodigy in the truest sense of the word. He entered the collegiate school, which eventually became Yale University, at 13.
13 years old. I mean, at 13, I was, trying to figure out a bike. He's enrolling in college.
He's not just, sitting in the back of the class taking notes. He's engaging with the heavyweights.
Yeah.
The source material says he's reading John Locke's essay concerning human understanding.
Which is dense reading for a graduate student in philosophy today, let alone a teenager in 1710s.
And he loved it. He said he found more pleasure in reading Locke than, and this is a direct quote, the most greedy miser finds when gathering up handfuls of silver and gold. So he had this voracious, almost physical appetite for understanding how the mind works, how reality is structured. But at the same time, he was obsessed with the physical world.
Which seems like a contradiction, but it wasn't for him. This is where the famous flying spider essay comes in. And I think this is such a crucial piece of the puzzle.
I agree.
Because it proves he wasn't just some mystic living in a cloud. He was a naturalist, a scientist, really.
He wrote this letter, it's essentially a scientific paper, when he was maybe 12 or 13. He had been observing these tiny spiders that seemed to fly through the air on threads of silk.
Ballooning spiders.
Right. And he wasn't just saying, oh, look, flying spiders. He was mapping out their geometry. He was calculating how they spun their webs to catch the updrafts from the sun-warmed ground. He analyzed the physics of the buoyancy involved. It reads like a submission to the Royal Society in London. It's that rigorous.
And this is the signature Edwards move, isn't it? He doesn't stop at the aerodynamics. He never just stays with the physical observation.
Never. He pivots immediately from the biology to the theology. He can't help himself.
So for the young Edwards, the spider's flight wasn't just a cool evolutionary trick or a neat bit of physics.
No, it was evidence. It was a sign. He saw the unbelievable complexity of the spider's instinct and its design as a direct, unmediated reflection of a creator who delights in intricate, beautiful mechanics. For him, the physical world was a shadow.
A shadow of the spiritual world.
Exactly. One pointed to the other. They weren't separate categories.
Okay, so this brings us to a really interesting conflict. You might assume, based on this, that a pious kid who sees God in spiders would just naturally love all religious doctrine. He'd just accept it all.
You would think so. But the sources are very clear. He recounts a very specific and very intense spiritual crisis as a young man.
And it's a crisis that I think a lot of people, especially people with a strong sense of their own agency, can probably relate to.
Absolutely. Edwards, in his personal narrative, says he hated the doctrine of God's sovereignty.
Let's break that down. We're talking about the Calvinist idea, right? The idea that God chooses who he saves and who he condemns, and that human beings have no real vote in the matter.
That's the one. He called it a horrible doctrine. That's his own word. Horrible.
Why? What was so horrible about it to him?
It offended his reason. It offended his sense of fairness. I mean, think about it. It seems arbitrary. It seems unjust. He fought against it intellectually because, like any rational person, he wanted to believe he had some agency in his own destiny, and that his choices mattered.
So how does a guy who despises the idea of an absolute God become the primary, most powerful spokesman for it in American history? The biography mentions a booth in the swamp.
It's such a great image, isn't it?
Yeah.
He and his schoolmates literally built a small booth out in a swamp near the school, a secret place to go and pray.
He was wrestling with this, actively fighting it.
He was trying to square his own powerful desire for autonomy with the inescapable logic of an all-powerful creator. He was stuck.
And the shift, when it happened, wasn't gradual. He doesn't describe it as a slow dawning. He describes it almost like a lens snapping into focus.
That's a great way to put it. He says he was reading a passage in the Bible, 1 Timothy, and suddenly the very doctrine he had fought against, the very idea he found so horrible, God's absolute sovereignty appeared to him as, and I'm quoting again, exceedingly pleasant, bright, and sweet.
That word sweet keeps coming up in his writing. It's such an odd word for something as rigid and, terrifying as absolute sovereignty.
It is, but I think it marks the crucial transition. It's the moment he went from fighting the logic to surrendering to it. He had an intellectual breakthrough.
What was the breakthrough?
He realized a fundamental truth, at least for his system. If God is truly God, if he is the infinite, uncreated source of all reality, then he must be absolute. He must be sovereign.
A God who has to negotiate with you isn't really God.
Right. A God who is limited by your free will or who has to check with you before he does something isn't a God worth worshiping. That's just a superpowered human, a cosmic committee chairman.
So for him, the surrender was an intellectual recognition that the idea of human autonomy is, itself, a logical absurdity, a myth.
Precisely. He came to believe that the only way the universe makes any coherent sense is if God is the king, not a consultant. And once he accepted that premise, the terror of losing control was replaced by the delight, the sweetness of being part of a perfect, coherent, all-encompassing system.
And he immediately tries to live this out. He codified this new mindset in his resolutions. These are essentially a contract he wrote with himself as a young man.
There are 70 of them, and they are unbelievably rigorous. There's no slack in them at all.
The one that always stops me in my tracks is number 63. Resolved to act just as I would do if I strove with all my might to be that one who should live in my time.
I mean, just think about the sheer audacity of that.
It's staggering.
He's imagining a hypothetical scenario. Let's say only one person in his entire generation is going to be a true, perfect example of a Christian. He resolves to live his life as if he is in a competition to be that one person.
It's the Olympics of holiness. There's no room for second place.
None. But notice what's driving it. It's not a resolution to be famous or wealthy or respected. It's a resolution to be perfectly aligned with reality as he now understands it.
That's the key.
It is. He treated religion not as a cultural hobby, not as a
Right.
weekend activity, but as an all-consuming logical necessity. If this God exists, and if he is absolute, then every single second of your life must be oriented toward him. There is no other rational choice.
This intensity, this absolute logical framework, it sets the stage for his first major public fight, doesn't it? We move from his private resolutions to a very public sermon in Boston.
Yes, God glorified in man's dependence. This was preached in 1731. It was his debut on the big stage, so to speak, and he chose to go right for the jugular,
The jugular being human pride.
the pride of the human heart, the illusion of autonomy.
He constructs this argument using 3 prepositions. It sounds like a dry grammar lesson, but the implications are massive. He says the redeemed are dependent on God for all their good in 3 ways: of God, through God, and in God.
Right, and the first two are fairly standard Christian theology, even for the time.
Let's break them down. Of God.
Of God means God is the author, the source. Your salvation, your goodness, it didn't originate with you. You didn't invent it. God is the fountain from which it flows.
And through God.
Through God means God is the medium, the purchaser, specifically Christ. He's the pipeline that the good flows through to get to you. It was bought at a price.
Okay, so far so good. Pretty standard stuff for a New England pulpit, but the in God part, that is where it gets radical.
It is.
Yeah.
This is the Edwards twist. When he says our good is in God, he means that God isn't just the giver of the gift. God is the gift itself. He is the object of our happiness.
So you don't rely on God to give you happiness as a separate thing.
No, God is the happiness. You don't rely on God to give you a stable, secure life. God is the stability. He is the substance of the good itself.
The text here suggests that the human being, in order to receive this, is effectively a vacuum, an empty space.
Exactly. Edwards argues that for God to be all in all, the creature must be nothing. He uses the language of emptying over and over. We have to be hollowed out of our own self-sufficiency, our own supposed goodness, so that we can be filled with this absolute dependence.
This directly challenges the very core of the modern secular or atheist project, which is the construction of the self.
The entire project.
The modern view is that I generate my own value. I have intrinsic rights. I have an identity that is mine and mine alone. I build myself.
Edwards would look at that and call it theft. He believes that every time you claim autonomy, you are stealing a piece of glory that belongs only to the absolute, to God. He argues our dependence on God is absolute and immediate.
Immediate in the sense of right now, this very second.
This very millisecond. There is no buffer. This isn't deism, where God is like a watchmaker who winds up the universe and then walks away to let it tick. Edwards believes God is actively, consciously holding your atoms together in this specific moment. If he were to, get distracted for a nanosecond, you would simply cease to exist. You'd vanish.
He creates a fascinating distinction here regarding grace, using the word arbitrary. Now, to a modern listener, arbitrary sounds awful. It sounds random, unfair, capricious, like a lottery.
And he knows that. He's a master of language. He's using that word deliberately. But he's using it in its strict philosophical sense, which means not bound by obligation.
Meaning God doesn't owe us anything.
Zero. Nothing. This is maybe the most crucial point to understand Edwards' entire universe. If you are a sinner, and in his view, everyone is born a sinner, you have forfeited your standing in the cosmic court. You are a rebel. You are guilty of treason against the king of the universe.
So the king owes the traitor nothing but punishment.
Exactly. So if God chooses to save you, to show you grace, it is purely because he wants to. Not because he has to. Not because you're a good person. Not because you're worth it. It is an act of pure, unconstrained, sovereign will.
He contrasts this with Adam in the Garden of Eden, which I thought was a brilliant legal argument.
It is, isn't it? He says, look, Adam was dependent on God, yes, but Adam was under what he calls a covenant of works. He was like an employee.
He had a contract.
Contract. If Adam did his job, which was obeying God perfectly, then God was obligated by his own promise to pay him with eternal life. So Adam had a little bit of leverage. He had his own righteousness to bargain with.
But the Christian, in his system,
The Christian is bankrupt. The Christian has already broken the contract. The Christian has failed. So the Christian comes to God with nothing, no leverage, no righteousness of their own. The salvation they receive is a pure charity handout.
which, as he argues, makes their dependence more absolute than even Adam's dependence was in paradise.
More absolute. It's a total humiliation of the human will. It's a complete dismantling of pride. You are arguing that to be saved, you have to stand before God and admit that you have zero leverage, zero value, zero anything to offer.
That is a hard sell. I mean, especially for the merchant class of colonial New England who built their entire lives on the concept of leverage and contracts and earning your keep.
It was a hard sell then, and it's an even harder sell now. But for Edwards, it wasn't about making a sale. It was about describing reality. He believed this was the only way to align with the truth of the universe.
Which brings us to the moment where he takes this cold, hard logic of absolute dependence and turns it into a weapon of pure psychological terror. We have to talk about sinners in the hands of an angry God.
July 8, 1741. Enfield, Connecticut. The most famous or infamous sermon in American history.
The folklore around this sermon is just wild. You read accounts of people screaming, fainting, literally holding onto the church pews because they thought the floor was opening up to swallow them. But when you actually read the text, and we have the full manuscript right here in our sources, it doesn't read like a frantic, screaming rant. It's not unhinged.
Yeah. No, and that is the most common misconception. Eyewitnesses said Edwards wasn't shouting. He likely read it in a calm, level, almost monotone voice. The terror didn't come from the volume. It came from the ruthless, systematic, inescapable logic. He is dismantling the listener's every sense of safety, point by point, like a demolition expert.
The central text he uses is from the book of Deuteronomy. Their foot shall slide in due time.
And he just obsesses over the physics of that image. A sliding foot.
It implies gravity, doesn't it? Something is pulling you down.
Exactly. Edwards asked the congregation a simple question. Why do things fall? They fall because the earth attracts them, they have weight. He then argues that the soul of a natural, unsaved person is heavy. It is weighted down with guilt and sin. So the natural place for that soul is down, in the pit.
So destruction isn't an unusual event that God has to cause. It's the natural state of things. It's the default.
Yes. The slide into hell is what physics wants to happen. It's the path of least resistance. The only reason you aren't sliding into that pit right now, he argues, is because an external force is actively and unnaturally stopping it.
This is where the famous imagery comes in. The spider.
The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked.
It's just so visceral. But you know, the image that actually disturbs me more, reading it again, is the rotten covering.
Ah, yes. He tells the congregation that they imagine they are safe, but in reality, they are walking over the pit of hell on a rotten covering. A covering with holes in it so thin you can't see them.
It suggests that the solid ground we think we are standing on, our good health, our job, our morality, the actual floor of the church, is a complete deception. It's structurally unsound.
And this connects directly back to his view of nature. This is a complete 180-degree inversion of the modern atheist or materialist view.
How so?
If you're a materialist, you probably view the universe as, at worst, indifferent.
Yeah.
The sun shines, the rain falls, tectonic plates shift. It's just cold, neutral matter doing its thing. It doesn't care about you.
Edwards looks at the same universe and says, no, you're wrong. The universe is hostile to you.
He says, and this is another quote, "The earth does not bear you willingly." He argues that the sun doesn't want to shine on you to give you light to go about your day serving sin. The air doesn't want to fill your lungs while you use that breath to ignore God. He says the whole of creation groans under the weight of the sinner.
So in Edwards' worldview, nature is actively trying to vomit you out. You are the infection. You are the foreign body.
You are the anomaly. The universe obeys its creator. You don't. So the universe wants to get rid of you. It is aligned against you. And the only reason it doesn't succeed is because the angry God is holding it back.
This just completely reframes the whole anger concept. We usually picture an angry God as someone throwing lightning bolts at you. But Edwards is arguing that God's moment-by-moment action is actually restraining the universe from executing its natural justice on you. His hand is the only thing between you and annihilation.
Precisely. The mere arbitrary will and uncovenanted, unobliged forbearance of an incensed God is the only thing acting as a shield between you and the natural hostility of reality. He's systematically stripping away every illusion of peace and safety. He wants you to feel the terrifying precariousness of your existence.
Okay, if we stop the analysis there, Jonathan Edwards is just a monster. He's a psychological terrorist using theology to break people.
And many people do stop there. That's the caricature.
But if you keep reading, if you look at the rest of the source material, there is a dramatic pivot. The same mind that imagined the spider dangling over the fire also imagined the sweetness of honey.
This is what we're calling the taste of honey.
Oh.
We're looking at a completely different sermon here. one called a divine and supernatural light.
The title alone signals a massive shift in tone. We are moving from the crushing weight of gravity to the illumination of light.
But he's very, very careful here. When he starts talking about this spiritual light, the first thing he has to do is define what it is not.
Right, because this is happening during the Great Awakening, and the word enthusiasm was a very dirty word in the 18th century.
It was a huge concern for the establishment.
Hmm.
Enthusiasm back then didn't mean you're just excited about something.
Yeah.
It meant religious fanaticism. It meant people claiming they heard voices from God, that they were getting new prophecies, that they were above the Bible. It was chaos.
So Edwards, who was a leader of this revival, is also terrified that it's devolving into that. He has to draw a line.
A very clear line. So he says, this divine light is not new information. It's not a secret voice in your head telling you things that aren't in Scripture. It's not a flight of fancy or a vivid imagination.
So what is it?
It is a new sense of the existing information, a new perception. And this is where he uses the honey analogy, which I honestly think is one of the most brilliant and effective philosophical illustrations ever used.
Okay, walk us through it.
He says there are two different ways to know that honey is sweet. The first way is by a rational judgment. You can look at a jar of honey. You can read a textbook that describes its chemical composition. Your friend can tell you it's sweet. You can believe with 100% intellectual certainty that honey is sweet.
But you haven't actually tasted it.
Right. You have an intellectual knowledge about it. The second way to know is to put a small drop of honey on your tongue. In that single moment, you have a direct sensory knowledge of its sweetness that the scientist who only read the book will never, ever have.
It's experiential, not just theoretical.
It is the scent of the heart. Edwards argues that you can be a brilliant theologian. You can be a committed atheist who has memorized the entire Bible just to win debates. You can know everything there is to know about God. But the saint, the true believer, is the one who has tasted the sweetness of God's glory.
Does this mean reason is useless? Because everything we established earlier is that Edwards is a master logician, a student of Locke. It seems contradictory for him to suddenly say, oh, just feel it.
This is the genius of it. He doesn't bypass reason. He argues that this divine light sanctifies reason. It perfects it.
How?
Think about it this way. If you have a deep-seated prejudice against someone, can you think clearly and rationally about them?
No, of course not. Enmity makes us irrational. We interpret everything they do or say in the worst possible light. Our reason is clouded by our feelings.
Edwards argues that the natural, unregenerate man has an innate enmity against God, a deep-seated prejudice. That is why the atheist looks at the universe and sees only cold, random, meaningless matter, while Edwards looks at the same universe and sees overwhelming glory.
It's not that the atheist is stupid or irrational.
Not at all. It's that the atheist is sensorily impaired, their rational faculties being distorted by this underlying enmity.
It's a form of spiritual blindness.
Exactly. And a blind man can't argue against the existence of colors just because he's never seen them. Edwards argues that the divine light is what heals the eye. It removes the enmity. Once you taste that God is good, your reason is finally set free to follow the evidence to its logical conclusion without prejudice.
So in his view, the true believer is the only one who is being truly rational, because they're the only one working with the full data set. They have the intellectual data and the sensory data of the taste.
That is his claim. The light is immediate, he says. It doesn't use a middleman. It is God acting directly on the soul to grant a new sense.
Now, this focus on the individual experience, the spider over the pit, the honey on the tongue, it can make it sound like Edwards was a solitary mystic just focused on the individual soul. But he ran a church for over 2 decades. He was a community leader.
A very prominent one.
And his theology had a very sharp, very defined social edge to it.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we get into his views on community, exclusion, and even politics, which are often overlooked. A great example is the sermon Ruth's Resolution.
This is based on the biblical story of Ruth, who was a Moabite, a foreigner. She leaves her own country and her own people to follow her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, back to Israel.
Edwards takes this story and uses it as a model for what he calls the social contract of the convert. When you have that moment where you taste that honey, you don't just sit there smiling to yourself in private. You move. You change allegiances. You join the people of God. Ruth's famous words, "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God."
And the flip side of that is also true. Your old people shall not be my people anymore.
He is very, very clear on the necessity of separation. You have to leave Moab, which for his congregation meant your old companions, your old habits, your old way of life. If your friends stay in sin, he argues, you have to cut ties. It causes a division.
That sounds incredibly elitist and exclusive to a modern ear.
It is. It creates a distinct, exclusive community of the saved. And Edwards was completely unafraid of hierarchy. In fact, if you look at another one of his sermons, The Many Mansions, he argues that heaven itself is a strict hierarchy.
Wait a minute, I always thought heaven was supposed to be the great equalizer. Everyone gets a white robe, everyone gets a harp, everyone sings in the choir. A perfect democracy.
Edwards says absolutely not. He argues there are degrees of glory in heaven. God is the king, and heaven is his palace. And in any royal court, some people sit closer to the king's throne than others.
Based on what? How do you get a better seat?
Based on their holiness and their capacity for enjoying God, which was developed here on earth. He argues that while salvation itself is a free gift, that arbitrary grace we talked about, your status in heaven is determined by your works and your love for God on earth.
So he actually encourages a kind of ambition.
Spiritual ambition, yes. He explicitly warns his congregation against fighting for the best seat in the earthly meeting house. That's just social climbing and vanity. But he says you should be fiercely ambitious for a high seat in heaven.
This hierarchical, orderly view of the universe spills over directly into his politics, too. We have the sermon, A Strong Rod Broken and Withered.
He preached this sermon on the occasion of the death of Colonel John Stoddard, who was a local magistrate, a political leader, and a very powerful figure in the region.
And he calls the ruler a strong rod. That's a powerful image.
It is, and it connects directly back to his view of human nature. Remember the sliding foot from sinners. Edwards believed that human nature, left to its own devices, is naturally depraved. It wants to fall. It wants chaos. It slides downward.
So you can't be a libertarian in Jonathan Edwards' universe. You can't just trust people to do the right thing.
Absolutely not. If gravity is constantly pulling everyone down into chaos, you need a strong structure to hold them up. You need a strong rod. He viewed the magistrate, the ruler, not just as a manager or an administrator, but as a levee holding back a flood of anarchy and social collapse.
He talks about the giddy people.
Yes. He had a deep distrust of the mob. He believed the giddy people, the unstable, emotional, easily swayed masses needed firm, authoritative, rational leadership to keep society from destroying itself.
So when a leader like Colonel Stoddard dies, it isn't just a sad event or a political vacancy.
It's a judgment from God. For Edwards, it's a sign that God is removing a pillar of stability from the community, leaving them more vulnerable to their own worst impulses. He's weakening the dam.
Which brings us, with a kind of tragic irony, to the final act of his own career. He was the strong rod of his church in Northampton. He was the intellectual giant, the spiritual father for a generation, and yet the giddy people eventually broke him.
It's one of the great tragedies of American intellectual history. This is segment 6, the tragedy of rejection.
We really need to set the scene here. The year is 1750. Edwards has been the pastor of the church in Northampton for 23 years. He's internationally famous. He led his town through the Great Awakening, and then he gets fired.
And not just fired.
Yeah.
Humiliated. The vote to dismiss him was overwhelming, something like 200 to 20 against him.
So why, after all that time, what happened? Was it the hellfire preaching? Did they finally get tired of being called spiders and loathsome insects?
Surprisingly, no. The historical accounts suggest the congregation was actually quite used to the terror sermons. They saw it as part of the package. The real issues that led to his dismissal were much more practical and much more about church politics.
It started with something called the bad books case, right?
That was a major factor. He discovered that some of the young people in the church, including some from the town's most powerful families, were secretly passing around a book that he considered immoral, likely a midwife's manual with anatomical drawings. He handled it very clumsily, publicly calling out the names, and it alienated those powerful families. He lost their support.
But the real explosion, the thing that broke the camel's back, was about communion.
This requires a little bit of context. His grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, was a legend. He was the pastor in Northampton for decades before Edwards, and he had a very open, very inclusive policy on communion.
The halfway covenant.
Essentially, yes. Stoddard let almost anyone take communion, even if they weren't sure they were truly saved or regenerate. He viewed communion as a converting ordinance, meaning the ritual itself might help you along the path to belief.
And Edwards, being the rigorous, absolute logician that he was, eventually came to the conclusion that this made no sense.
Complete nonsense in his view. Edwards looked at his own theology of absolute dependence and the divine light and said no. Communion is a family meal. It is for the team. It is for the people who have made a credible profession of faith, the ones who have tasted the honey. If you haven't done that, you can't eat at the table. It's a contradiction.
So he tried to close the door that his famous, beloved grandfather had thrown wide open.
And the town revolted. They saw it as an attack on their standing, on their rights as church members. They felt he was judging them, setting himself up as the gatekeeper. It was a clash between the strong rod and the burgeoning democratic spirit of the town.
And in the end, the democratic spirit won.
By a landslide, they voted him out of his pulpit.
So here is the moment. It's June 22, 1750. He's been publicly humiliated and rejected by the people he has ministered to for a generation. He has a large family to feed and literally nowhere to go, and he stands up in that same pulpit to give his farewell sermon. You would expect him to be bitter. You'd expect him to lash out at the giddy people who had wronged him.
But he doesn't. And this is where you see his absolute universe worldview in practice. The tone of the sermon is incredibly calm. It's solemn. There's no anger, just a kind of dreadful finality.
He focuses almost the entire sermon on one single concept, the meeting.
Yes. The central theme isn't goodbye, it's see you later. Specifically, he says, ministers and the people that have been under their care must meet one another before Christ's tribunal at the last day.
He reframes his firing not as an end, but as a temporary suspension of their relationship.
He basically says to them, you have voted to end this relationship here on earth, fine. But your vote is not the final verdict. We are all going to meet again. And when we meet, there will be an infallible judge who is present for every sermon, every conversation, every private thought.
It's the ultimate audit.
Exactly. He warns them that the relationship between a pastor and a congregation is a sacred contract that God himself will audit. The minister, he says, must account for how he preached. Was he faithful to the truth? Did he warn them of danger? And the people must account for how they listened. Did they heed the warnings?
That is utterly terrifying. It takes a local parish squabble and elevates it to a cosmic trial with eternal consequences.
It completely removes the ambiguity. In our world, when there's a conflict, we argue endlessly about who was right and who was wrong. He said, she said. Edward just bypasses all of that and says, the judge will settle it. And reading the sermon, it is crystal clear that Edwards is supremely confident the judge will rule in his favor.
He warns them specifically about Arminianism creeping into the church after he's gone. We should probably define that, because he uses it like a curse word.
To Edwards, Arminianism was the great enemy. It was any theology that gave human beings a vote in their own salvation. The idea that your free will is the deciding factor, that you choose God rather than God choosing you.
The creeping illusion of autonomy again.
It's the root of all error, in his view. He saw it as a spiritual virus. He warns them that by firing him, their strong rod of theological orthodoxy, they're opening the floodgates to these corrupt principles. He tells them with this chilling finality, I am clear of your blood.
And then he packs his bags. He goes from being arguably the most famous intellectual in America to a missionary on the wild frontier.
Stockbridge, Massachusetts, a tiny outpost where he was a missionary to the Housatonic Indians. He taught Native American children. He lived in a small house in relative obscurity. And ironically, it was there in that exile that he wrote his greatest, most profound philosophical works, like The Freedom of the Will.
And then the final, deeply ironic act, segment 7, the death of the mind.
The year is 1757. After years in the wilderness, he gets a call. He's been appointed the president of the College of New Jersey, which we now know as Princeton University.
Finally, a position that matches his towering intellect. He moves to Princeton. But there's a smallpox outbreak sweeping through the area.
Now we have to remember, Edwards is a man of science. He's not a superstitious person who's afraid of medicine. He was a huge admirer of Isaac Newton and John Locke. He believed God worked through natural means, including science.
So he decides to lead by example. He takes the smallpox inoculation,
Which was a very new and controversial procedure at the time. It was risky. It involved taking a small amount of the live virus from a pustule and infecting the patient to try and build immunity. He wanted to set a good example for the students and show that science and faith were not enemies.
And what happened?
It killed him. The inoculation went wrong. He developed a secondary infection in his throat and glands. After only a few weeks as president of Princeton, he died on March 22, 1758.
It feels so random, so absurd. The greatest theological mind in America, a genius of logic and system, killed by a medical experiment gone wrong.
To us, it feels random. It feels like a tragic accident. But listen to his last words, as reported by his daughter. He's lying there, dying from a procedure he chose, leaving his wife and large family behind. He whispers, "Trust in God, and ye need not fear."
Even then, in that moment.
Even then, he died exactly as he lived. He believed that the inoculation going wrong wasn't an accident, it wasn't bad luck. It was the absolute and immediate sovereign hand of God. It was the sliding foot happening in God's due time. He trusted the sovereign disposition of all events, whether they were sweet like honey or as bitter as this unexpected death.
So let's try to bring this all home. We've walked through the biography, the boy scientist, the spider, the honey, the rejection, the death. When we step back and look at this complete, absolute universe that Jonathan Edwards constructed, what is the takeaway? What does this mean for us today?
I think more than anything else, Edwards forces us to confront the idea of absolute reality.
What do you mean by that?
We live in a world of distraction. We live in a customized, curated reality where we build our own feeds, our own truths, our own bubbles. We are masters of our tiny digital domains. Edwards smashes all of that to pieces. He argues that underneath all our illusions, we are dangling by a single fragile thread over an abyss.
Right, we are utterly dependent on forces we cannot control.
You can call that force God. You can call it physics. You can call it fate or the laws of the universe. But Edwards's core argument is that you are not the center. There is something massive, something terrifyingly powerful, and in his view, something ultimately beautiful that holds you in existence from moment to moment.
And you have to reckon with it. You can't just ignore the gravity while you're walking on the slippery slope.
Exactly. The angry God who holds the spider is also the sweet light who gives the taste of honey. It's the same source. And the challenge from Edwards that echoes down to us is this. Stop pretending you're autonomous. Stop living in the fantasy. Open your eyes, taste the honey, or else sooner or later you will feel the gravity.
It is a profoundly sobering worldview, but there is a strained, almost terrifying comfort in it too, isn't there? In the idea that something is absolute.
That brings me to a final provocative thought to end on. Edwards believed that on the day of judgment, all disagreements would simply vanish. Why? Because the truth, with a capital T, would be so bright, so overwhelming, so undeniable that it would silence all arguments.
No more debates, no more opinions.
No more Twitter arguments, no more my truth versus your truth, just
Yeah.
the truth revealed. Now, in our world, we are exhausted by constant debate. We are worn out by the relativism where nothing seems solid, nothing seems true for everyone.
So my question is this. Is there something secretly comforting, or is it just terrifying in the idea of a truth so bright and absolute that it silences everyone?
Is it terrifying to the ego? Yes, completely. But is it also the only thing that could possibly finally bring peace to a world of endless conflict? Edwards would say yes. The silence of the judgment day is the silence of things finally being set right.
That is something to chew on. The absolute universe. It might crush your ego, but at least it's real.
In his view, it's the only thing that is.
You've been listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.